The lock didn't work anymore. I stood on the porch of the house I grew up in, jiggling it like it might be some kind of mistake, some kind of glitch. It wasn't a glitch. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, I could see my mother's shape moving in the kitchen, unbothered, as if she couldn't hear me knocking. I knocked harder. My knuckles turned red in the cold. Finally, my father cracked the door open just wide enough to shove 2 garbage bags onto the porch and say 5 words I'll never forget as long as I live: "You don't live here anymore." The bags held my clothes, not folded, not packed with any care, just crammed into black plastic like trash waiting for pickup. My winter coat was in there, the good one, the one I'd bought myself with my first real paycheck as a nurse. My father didn't wait for a response. He shut the door, and I heard the deadbolt turn. I want to explain how we got here, because none of this happened out of nowhere. My parents, Richard and Colleen Bennett, had spent the last 2 years slowly pulling away from me, ever since I refused to hand over the small inheritance my grandmother had left me when I turned 30. It wasn't a fortune, $60,000 tucked into an account my grandmother had set up before she passed. My father wanted it to cover what he called family investments. I wanted it to stay exactly where it was, untouched, because something about the way he asked for it felt less like a request and more like an entitlement. When I said no, the temperature in that house changed. Dinners got shorter. Phone calls stopped being returned. And now, 3 days before Christmas, I was standing outside in 17-degree weather, holding 2 garbage bags of my own belongings, while my parents pretended I was a stranger on their porch. I called my older brother, Grant, first. He didn't pick up. I called my best friend from nursing school, Priyanka. She was already on a flight to visit her in-laws in Ohio and couldn't do anything from 30,000 feet, except send me a flurry of panicked texts. I sat in my car in the driveway for nearly an hour with the heater running, trying to think of anywhere I could go. My apartment lease had ended 2 weeks earlier. I'd been staying at my parents' house temporarily while I hunted for a new place, which now felt like the cruelest kind of irony. Every hotel near downtown was either booked solid for the holidays or priced at a number that made my stomach drop when I checked my bank balance, still bruised from a car repair the month before. By 9 that night, with the snow coming down harder, I ended up parked outside a building with a hand-painted sign reading Grace Street Shelter. I'd driven past it 100 times in my life and never once imagined I'd walk through its doors. But I did. I carried my 2 garbage bags inside, past a folding table holding a half-decorated plastic tree, and a volunteer named Warwick signed me in without a single judgmental question. He just handed me a cot number and a blanket and said, "Christmas is 2 days out. We'll get you settled before then." That's how I found myself on Christmas Eve, sitting on a thin cot in a shelter gymnasium that smelled like coffee and wet wool, surrounded by strangers who each carried their own version of how they'd landed there. The woman on the cot beside me looked to be in her 60s, silver hair pulled into a tight bun, with sharp, alert eyes that didn't match the weariness of the room. She'd been watching me for a while before she finally spoke. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice quieter than I expected. "Thea," I said. "Thea Bennett." She went still. Completely still, the way people go still when they've heard something they weren't ready to hear. Then she reached over and gripped my wrist, hard enough that I almost pulled away. "Bennett," she repeated. "Your grandmother was Eleanor Bennett." I nodded slowly, my heart starting to pound in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Your grandmother hired me," the woman said, her eyes filling with something between grief and urgency. 10 years ago. She told me this exact thing might happen one day, and she left you something, but only if I found you here, like this. Homeless. She knew. She knew they would do this to you. I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, what my grandmother could possibly have arranged from beyond the grave that hinged on me winding up in a shelter on Christmas Eve. But before I could get a word out, a security guard called the woman's name from across the room, and she stood up fast, telling me to wait right where I was, that she'd be back with something she'd been carrying for a decade. The woman's name, I'd learn moments later, was Bernadette Ferris. She came back across the gymnasium floor holding a worn leather satchel against her chest like it held something fragile enough to shatter. She sat back down beside me, unzipped it with hands that trembled slightly, and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, along with a small key wrapped in a handkerchief. "Your grandmother came to me this spring before she died," Bernadette said. "She didn't trust your parents. She told me plainly, Richard has a gambling problem, and Colleen has spent 30 years covering for him. She said if anything ever happened to her, they'd find a way to take everything, including you, if you let them close enough." Bernadette pressed the envelope into my hands. "She paid me every year for 10 years just to keep this safe, and to keep watching. She said if you ever ended up truly down and out, not just struggling, but with nowhere else to turn, that would be the sign they'd finally shown their true colors. And that's when I was supposed to find you and give you this." My hands shook as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in my grandmother's handwriting, along with a folded document from a law office in the next county. The letter explained that she'd placed the deed to a small property, a modest house on Larkspur Lane, bought quietly under a separate trust years before she passed, one my parents never knew existed, entirely in my name. She'd also left an account holding an additional $40,000 with the same firm, to be released only once Bernadette confirmed I'd been found in a shelter or otherwise displaced. My grandmother's words on that page hit me harder than the cold ever had. If you're reading this in a place like that, it means they did exactly what I feared. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from them while I was alive. Let this protect you now. I sat there on that cot, snow still falling past the gymnasium windows, holding proof that my grandmother had seen my parents clearly, years before I'd let myself admit the truth about them. Bernadette squeezed my shoulder and told me the law office, Whitfield and Cross, would be reachable the day after Christmas, and that she kept records of every single check-in, in case anyone ever tried to contest it. She'd done all of it out of loyalty to a woman who paid her not just in money but in trust, because my grandmother told her I deserved someone in my corner, for the day the family I was born into decided I didn't. The next morning, I called Whitfield and Cross the moment their office opened. A paralegal named Odalise confirmed everything Bernadette had told me and booked an appointment for December 26th. 2 days later, I sat across from an attorney named Foster Whitfield, who walked me through the trust documents line by line. The house on Larkspur Lane was small, a 2-bedroom bungalow with an overgrown garden, but it was mine, free and clear, with no mortgage and no ties to my parents whatsoever. The $40,000 was released to me within the week, once Bernadette's decade of documented check-ins was verified. I moved into that house in the first week of January. It needed work, the pipes groaned, the paint peeled in the hallway, the garden was a tangle of dead branches. But it was quiet, and it was mine, and nobody could tell me I didn't live there. I changed the locks before I unpacked a single box. My parents found out about the inheritance 3 weeks later, when my father showed up uninvited, having tracked down the address through a cousin. He stood on my new porch, in my driveway, on my property, and demanded to know why my grandmother had gone behind the family's back. I told him, calmly, that she hadn't gone behind anyone's back. She'd simply protected the one person in the family who'd never asked her for anything. He didn't have a response to that. I asked him to leave, and for the first time in my life, he actually did. I still think about that Christmas Eve on the cot, about Bernadette's hand gripping my wrist, about how close I came to giving up hope entirely before everything changed. My grandmother spent 10 years preparing for a moment she hoped would never come, just so I wouldn't be truly alone when it did. I don't know if I'll ever fully repair things with my parents, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to anymore. But I know that somewhere, my grandmother saw this exact moment coming, and she made sure that even at my lowest point, I would land somewhere solid.